There are a lot of how I would learn to code videos on YouTube, but mine's a little bit different. You see, I've been programming for 27 years. Yes, you heard that right, 27 years. I didn't do a boot camp or learn from an online course. I was 8 years old when I first learned to code, and I learned to code from a book. It was a book on BASIC that I borrowed from my dad from his old ZX Spectrum days. I learned to code from a book not through choice, but because there was no other option. The internet wasn't mainstream yet, and it would be a few years yet before I heard that familiar sound from a 56k modem. It was the mid-90s and computers looked a lot more like blocks of concrete than something from a sci-fi film. I started out by creating simple console games, so things like Guess the Number or very rudimentary chatbots, nothing like we have with the AI today. When the internet finally did arrive to my little corner of the world, we were only allowed to use it for about 10 minutes at a time, so it didn't tie up the phone line and stop my relatives from calling. At some point we got always on internet, and it didn't block the phone line, which kept my mum happy. And this is where the fun really began. I started dabbling with websites. I actually created my first website in Microsoft Word, believe it or not. You can actually save a document as a HTML page and then view it in your browser. So I took those files and I uploaded them to the free FTP server that my ISP gave me, which I also learned how to do from a book. I started using other website builders such as Dreamweaver, which was Macromedia Dreamweaver back then, before it was bought out by Adobe. Dreamweaver was really good, but I wanted to do more than just drag and drop elements inside the UI. So I started to learn HTML and CSS and look into the source code of how other websites are built. As a kid, I had a habit of taking electronics apart just to see how they worked. I took apart an old tape recorder, I took apart my dad's ZX Spectrum, I even took apart my Game Boy. Nothing was safe from my screwdriver. And I took this enthusiasm of taking things apart into the online world as well. So if there was a cool menu effect that I wanted to use, I'd save the website and then I'd take it apart. I'd delete piece by piece until all I was left with was the code for the menu. A lot of the really cool effects were using JavaScript, so I started learning that as well. And this was before we had Angular, React, or even jQuery. I soon moved on from making static websites. I wanted my websites to actually do something. So I learned PHP and MySQL, and this was about the time that WordPress came out, so I started learning that as well. On the side, I was learning a bit of Visual Basic on Windows 98, and I even made an application for my dad, which I later sold on marketplaces and forums. That year, I made more money than I ever could from any part-time job. Bear in mind, I was 14 at the time. As new technologies came out, I started learning those too, just because I was interested in them. When I went to university, I learned other programming languages such as C and Fortran, and I carried on making websites on the side. Now, I studied physics, so it wasn't exactly a major part of the curriculum. In my first job out of university, I was coding in C and C++, and then later on, I started coding in .NET. Since then, I've picked up a lot of different languages along the way and learned a lot of different frameworks as well. So how would I learn to code if I was to start over? For one, we have the internet now with so many different resources to learn from, so I wouldn't learn to code from a book, although there are some really good ones out there. But to be honest, I probably wouldn't do too much differently. Throughout learning how to code, I never once followed a tutorial. I just built things I wanted to build because it would be fun. And if I didn't know how to do something, I'd look up and I'd find out how to do it. I didn't have the paradox of choice around what language or what framework to pick, because most of them didn't exist yet. I started with the basics such as HTML and CSS and used that to build out the projects that I wanted to build. And when my knowledge wasn't good enough to build what I wanted, I then learned some more. This is the best way to learn how to code. Start with the basics and start building projects. Build something you'd want to use. And when you don't know how to do something, learn it and keep learning. Keep coming up with bigger and bigger projects and keep learning more each time. Not only will it be easier to remember everything that you're learning, so you're actually putting it to practical use, but you'll be building up a portfolio of projects that you can show to a future employer. There was nothing worse when interviewing candidates than seeing that the technical test that you'd given them was the first time that they'd used GitHub and they checked it all in one commit. It's one thing to say that you have experience, but it's another thing altogether to actually prove it. If I was to learn to code step by step, I'd do this. I'd learn HTML and CSS and build a static website, and then host it somewhere like GitHub Pages. I'll then learn enough JavaScript just to be able to call an API. This is just so you can get some data on your website, just so it's actually doing something. There's plenty of free APIs that you can use to get data, whether it be for the weather or for stock prices. If you need to follow a tutorial to learn how to do something, then make sure it's not related to the application that you're building. If you're just blindly following a tutorial, you're not going to learn anything. For the next step, I'd learn how to code my own API using JavaScript and Express.js. Your API doesn't need to do much, it just needs to return some data. You could even call one of the free APIs from inside your API to do this. And last, I'd learn how to read and write from a database. Doesn't matter what database you learn, it could be MySQL or MongoDB or Postgres. If you know a little bit of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and how to read and write from a database, you can pretty much build anything. Most applications are what we call CRUD applications. They're just creating, reading, updating and deleting from a database. Try and create tools and websites that are going to scratch your own itch. To create a to-do list app, or a movie library, or maybe a social media automator, for example. If you're creating something that you're actually going to use, it will give you the motivation to keep going. I'll let you know a secret. The first application that I built used goto statements instead of loops. I hadn't read the chapter on loops yet, but that didn't stop me from getting started and building something. Don't waste your time learning how to code, watching YouTube video after YouTube video, but never actually building anything. A key part of learning is making mistakes, failing over and over again, and then finally working out how to do it. If you are serious about being a software developer, then you need to know that it's not all sunshine and rainbows. So make sure you watch this video next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.